Hello, friends and neighbors. Why, yes, it is Jenny again with a middle of the night video because I can't sleep and this stuff keeps me awake. But tonight I want to talk about something constructive. So, in one of my previous videos, I talked about the different ideas I have for tackling a lot of the stuff on the hilltop. And that's where I want to go this evening in discussing stuff with you. I mentioned something about working with other area commissions. Um, and I want to kind of explain that right now. Um, so we're talking, there's lots of discussions online right now about trash and about the crime and the prostitution. All of this works into this conversation. All of it does. Um, so in my studies of the hilltop, I have come across what I think is kind of the crux of our issue. And I would love to take credit for it, but I'm pretty sure that there are people that have been trying to draw attention to this for years and years and years, but we never really got to the heart of the issue. And nobody really has ever fleshed it out or mapped out a way to address it um, with the commission. So I want to see if this works because we've never really tackled it from this perspective before, and I think it might be the key to bringing about positive change in our community. So let me start with this. Some of this is going to be a little difficult to digest or might be uncomfortable to talk about for some, but please hear me out. I promise you, it all works out in the end. But so in my opinion, from my studies of the hilltop, I think that the root of our trouble, of the roots, the seeds of our decline, actually were planted about a century ago. Um, and it started with segregation in the hilltop. I've pinpointed it between 1915 and 1920. But back in that time, Black people in the hilltop were only allowed to live between Midland and Wheatland, South Wheatland, um, and Sullivan and Palmetto. Those streets were the only places where people of color could live. Um, in 1923, there was a major announcement about the creation of Broadview Edition, which most of you know as the older part of Westgate. It starts with Roy's Avenue and goes to pretty sure Brinker or Westgate. I always forget off the top of my head. But up to that point, most folks lived east of Hague. I mean, most of the hilltop lived east of Hague. West of Hague, there were a few farms. There were a few offices, like there's a doctor's office on Broad Street further up. But the majority of the hilltop, central hilltop, lived in what we now call Highland West. And in 1923, when they announced this opening of Broadview Edition with brand new lots for sale, and then like a month or two later announced the construction of the Westgate Lodge Temple. This was a huge shift in the way that the hilltop was laid out. At that time, the Westgate Lodge had hundreds of members, not just in the main lodge itself, but in their chapters. It was like Order of the Eastern Star, Job's Daughters. They had an entire choir that traveled the state. I mean, it was a huge thing. And back then, not everybody had a car. As a matter of fact, they used to publish directories of who owned cars in Columbus. And those directories are available on the Columbus Public Library website. So, and when I talk about the folks that lived east of Hague, this there was a mixture of you know, lower middle class to upper middle class folks. They were powerful folks. I mean, the Hilltop is one of the oldest neighborhoods in Columbus. So um, we had politicians, we had council members, we had Franklin County commissioners, we had state representatives, we had folks that worked in various offices um, in Columbus, the city auditor, the county auditor, city clerk, you name it. A lot of them lived here on the Hilltop. So when Westgate opened, or what we now know as Westgate opened, and the lodge was about to be constructed, um, this marked a gigantic shift um, in where people were about to live here on the Hilltop. So as many of these fancy people moved to Broadview/Westgate, that meant that they were isolating themselves from the folks east of Hague who were not white, or who were not involved in the lodge, were not running in the same circles as the fancy people who moved. And this becomes really evident when the Great Depression hits. So during the Great Depression, there was a federal program called the Homeowners Loan Corporation that was started with the intention of keeping homeowners from losing their homes. The Great Depression hit the Hilltop in a big, big way and hard. Even for the fancy folks in Westgate. I know one of my friends, when we did their home histories, they discovered that the original owners lost their home during the Great Depression, but were later able to buy it back, and probably with help from the Homeowners Loan Corporation program. But part of this program was they created a means of letting banks know who was eligible for these funds. And if you've ever heard the term redlining, this is where that came from. The HOLC created maps that they called neighborhood safety maps. And they were color coded to let people know which neighborhoods were safe, which ones were desirable, which ones were high risk or medium risk. And of course, the ones that they were not going to give loans to were shaded in red as high risk, like they were automatically denied. The next down, or next up, I should say, from red was yellow, and they were declining, but better than the red lined areas, and they would probably pay a higher interest rate than let's say the more favorable neighborhoods. The desirable neighborhoods were blue and green. Green was the best. Blue was, on the way up, I guess. So guess which areas were red? Most of them were black neighborhoods, or poor neighborhoods, or poor and black neighborhoods. Almost all of Franklinton was redlined because it was on a floodplain. Yes, they did have a small part of Franklinton that was all black, but almost all of Franklinton was redlined because it was on a floodplain, and their flooding measures weren't completely foolproof. On the Hilltop, the redlined areas, of course, were Midland, Clarendon, Highland, Wheatland, Oakley, and Wayne. And yes, I'm reading off a map. I'm dumb about, I don't know how to edit videos for anything. So all of the items that that kind of show you what I'm talking about are going to be in a link attached to this video. And I have different versions of this map. I have the entire map of Columbus. I have a zoomed in version that just shows the hilltop, with some notes on it for you to see. They're all in my Dropbox folder, and I will keep adding to it to kind of help back up what I'm talking about. There's also pictures of the hilltop from 1922 that will kind of help illustrate it for you in your mind, what I'm talking about. So, the only existing map that we have from this time is from 1936, but and which is the year that the program ended. But it is my opinion, from the research I've done, that this would have been the beginning of one of the very things that plagues us even today, which is absentee landlords, predatory landlords, slumlords. When the Great Depression hit, and those who couldn't get mortgages or get their homes refinanced lost their homes, that would have made them pretty vulnerable, made their properties vulnerable to outside property purchases, much like today. And I think that this kind of started the trend. We found this here in Westgate during the last housing market crash. Houses that now are going for 200, 250, during the housing market collapse went for 90,000, and people snapped them up and flipped them, and when the market got better they sold them for for twice what they paid. I think the same thing happened in Highland West, but instead of flipping them to sell for a higher price, I think they flipped them to rent. And in some cases, eventually, the practice of buying properties just to leave them vacant started. Those today, a lot of those are used as tax shelters. So these are still a problem, and I think that started back then. The other part of this is that comes to mind that makes me think this is the beginning of our troubles, is that, like I said, all of the fancy pants politicians and influential business folk moving to Westgate meant that they were busy thinking about development, expansion. Between the 20s and the 60s is when we really start to see expansion westward and southward. So like Great Western came about in the 60s, or 50s, I think. We had the development of West Mound Street to connect to downtown. This is when in this era when we see Holly Hill and Georgian Heights and Brookshire really becoming developed. As more people move away from the old hilltop, there's less of an emphasis or less of a concern about maintaining the infrastructure. There's also less representation for those folks left behind. They didn't, especially with the people of color who were not members of the Hilltop Business Association at the time, or weren't members of the Westgate Lodge, who weren't in the inner circles at that time. They couldn't bend their city councilman's ear as easily as somebody who was in these groups. They didn't have the same access. So representation became an issue. And this is part of why I mentioned in my last video something about working together and working and beginning to kind of to mobilize, that's the word, mobilize people to move this forward and to work on this together. Because what ended up happening here is there was a great division between the two ends that still exists today. I mean, we're still having arguments online about Westgate versus everybody else, right? So part of the reason why Westgate has been given so much attention over generations now is because it was built to be this fancy pants neighborhood. It was advertised the way that Upper Arlington was. And if you look at these neighborhood safety maps, the map of Columbus, you will see that Westgate is in green, as is Upper Arlington, parts of Worthington, and Bexley. And guess how they got that green designation? It's because they were all white. Now, that's not to say that all of the neighborhoods that were white only got that designation, but that redlining, that labeling of these neighborhoods this way, led to getting greater attention in that era. I recently discovered that the area known as Columbia Park Edition, which is across West Broad Street from Westgate, was also white only, but it was labeled in blue. So it was still ideal, but it wasn't as optimal as Westgate. But Westgate was where the mayors lived. It's where, Sensenbrenner and Westlake and Floyd Green lived. It's where all the big wigs lived. So they paid more attention to their own backyards and kind of forgot about the folks in Highland West. And this is a problem because during this time, the infrastructure was kind of put on the back burner. The infrastructure of Highland West was kind of left, for the time being, I'm sure in the back of their minds. But then they were just kind of forgotten after Sensenbrenner's time. And around the 60s is when we start to see drugs and drug-related crimes entering into the scene. So again, if you go back to the redlining map, you'll notice that there's the redlined area, and then the areas around it are yellow, which was like not as bad as red, but just kind of almost as bad. Well, even after this HOLC program ended, the reputation of these neighborhoods still remained. And there were still discriminatory practices going on. They weren't outlawed until the 60s, but they were done in different ways. They were done, by credit checks. And there were, back in the day, they used to have, they called them character loans. I mean, they did all kinds of crazy stuff to kind of skirt rules over generations. But by this time, the property values in the redlined areas had probably already lowered, which affected the areas around them in the yellow. And it's also around this time that businesses along Broad and Sullivan start to go away. We've got the drugs entering the picture in the 70s, or the 60s and 70s. And then in the 80s, we had the removal of federal and state funding for mental health programs, closing down institutions like the Central Ohio Psychiatric Hospital. This was an issue too. Right now, what we're dealing with addiction, with the opioid crisis, with people experiencing homelessness, we don't have any treatment for those folks because we don't have the resources to take care of them. So that becomes a problem for everybody, for the people experiencing these things, and for those wanting to seek help and not being able to find anything. But during all this time, there's spread. There's erosion of the neighborhood, starting from within. Infrastructure wise is what I infrastructure is what I focus on the most. I know that when we lived on North Ogden when I was a kid, um, we started when we first moved there. We had a brick street. The same old bricks from 1915 when the street was first carved out. They were ultimately paved over with asphalt, but it was done in such a sloppy, cheap way that our street flooded. And that is going on now. A lot of the flooding of the streets, the erosion of the curbs, that is due to haphazard paving that was not given the same kind of thought that, say, German Village has gotten in preserving their brick streets. So by the 70s, I mean, North Ogden was nowhere near the redlined area. As a matter of fact, during the HOLC and the era of these redlining maps, North Ogden was in the blue area. So this lowering of property values and lowering of concern for these areas or these parts of the neighborhood, the infrastructure, had started to spread out, and that included Broad Street, that included Sullivan Avenue, that included the business districts. So it's all there. Like I mean, I look at the red line map, and what I see is a growing cancer in our neighborhood that emanates from the redlined areas, and just continued to spread because there was nothing put in place to maintain the property values, or to maintain the quality of life for people living in Highland West. So it is my belief, because this didn't just affect the Hilltop. Right now, every neighborhood that we see on the news that has issues, Linden, Near East Side, there are others. They all contain previously redlined areas of Columbus. I believe that we need to join forces with the other area commissions from these neighborhoods, including Franklinton, especially Franklinton being our sister community, to work on kind of demands slash plan for the city of Columbus to tackle this. And I don't mean gentrification. I mean tackle the infrastructure. I don't care how poor how poor you are, whether you rent or own. At the very least, you should have safe streets, safe curbs, decent street lighting. You should have safe alleyways, decent trash pickup. We need to get rid of the 300-gallon dumpsters because they're doing us no good. And we've had those since 1985. All of this stuff works into this plan, and I plan on fully fleshing it out. I mean, I've got till January before I'm seated, so I've got some time. And if I have many more nights like this in the middle of the night, I'll definitely take the time to do that. But this is imperative for us. I mean, it's not just about the physical transformation of our neighborhoods. I mean, that's certainly part of it. But these things that I've talked about, the things that the basic property values and maintenance and that sort of thing, working on some sort of incentive to make sure that rental property owners actually live in our neighborhood and not outside of the city or outside of the state. We've got to work on that too. I think that may have to happen at the state level. I'm not sure how to go about it, but I think we need to talk to our state representatives. We are a food desert. We have no grocery stores accessible from on Sullivan or Broad, east of Wilson Road. I mean, we need city council to consider lobbying on our behalf to get good business here, and to bring things that are beneficial to our community, as well as tackling infrastructure issues that have been neglected for a century. I think there has got to be a way where getting Aldi to create or to build a couple of grocery stores on Sullivan and Broad, on the bus line, which would add jobs, which would create construction work to, which is usually one thing to understand about City Hall is that a lot of times the development that they get involved in and push for, they're paying back their campaign donors. And a lot of times they are construction companies or demolition companies. Low and Dick is a big one. I've forgotten some of the Pizzuti. All of those companies are interested in development projects. Create development here, but do it in a way that doesn't gentrify it and shove out people who aren't fancy. And do it in a way that's not going to create $1 million condos and prices out the folks who've been here forever. So yeah, that's kind of the start of my plan. I know there was more to it and my brain is starting to pause, but it's just food for thought for right now. I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna try and flesh it out a little bit more over time, but I think there is something for almost every committee on the GHAC to work on and work towards this. Oh, representation. That was the part that I wanted to get at. So there are two things that get council's attention: money and votes. And through the course of our community eroding, we have lost our political pull. We've lost the votes. I don't know if you have been here for a long time or all your life, but I remember that the bean dinners used to attract just about every politician under the sun, right? Yeah, they don't anymore because we don't have enough engaged voters. We don't have the numbers that we used to. So we're not that attractive to politicians anymore. We don't have the numbers to make demands of them or to present issues to them that they should be concerned with, right? Well, the commission is perfectly placed to start mobilizing people to push for things for the Hilltop. And if not the Hilltop, then all of these historically redlined neighborhoods together. When the GHAC was created, they used to have they used to have candidate nights where the public can come and ask questions of the candidates. The candidates would introduce themselves and then the audience would ask questions. They could meet the candidates and get to know what their platforms were. We need to reinstitute those. That would be through the Government Legislation Committee. We also need to do voter drives and make city issues pertaining to the Hilltop more clear for residents so that they understand why it's important to go to the polls. That power, those kind of initiatives will help get the attention of City Hall. Now, we don't have the money, that part, but they're interested in our property. And when we're not looking, when we're not paying attention, when we're not engaged, that is when the city and the state like to stick things over here that we don't necessarily want. And then we have to fight all that much harder to get what we want. So this is all part of my grand scheme to make us better. And I think that if we tackle these issues, they will help ease up the other problems that we've got going on: the trash, the prostitution and the crime. It is hard to cultivate a neighborhood with a whole bunch, to cultivate crime in a neighborhood where people are paying attention and they're actively working to make it better. Um, I have a lot of other ideas. They're not popping up in my head at the moment because it's 3 in the morning and the caffeine is starting to fail me. But just think about this for the time being, and we'll talk soon about other things too that will help us. So take care, neighbor. Talk to you soon. Bye.